Good morning, friends. And today we have Department of Medical Genetics presenting to us regarding patients whom we are not able to make diagnosis when they're alive. And you know that in genetic disease it is very important to know the correct diagnosis to do proper counseling. So how can we use parents' DNA to make correct diagnosis? So that is what they are enlightening us today about. Thank you.
Very good morning, respected teachers and dear colleagues. My name is Dr. Soumya Srivastava. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Genetics. And today, on behalf of the Department of Medical Genetics, we present retrospective diagnosis by parental testing in the NGS era, our experience. So, as a nation, as we strive to reduce our infant and neonatal mortality rates, we will see, as we have seen in other developed countries, that the most important etiology for many such disorders happens to be a genetic etiology. Now, this genetic etiology can be largely divided into two types: chromosomal or monogenic. And chromosomal disorders can be looked up by karyotype, FISH, or LLP or microarray. And for monogenic disorders, we have the next generation sequencing. And with this genetic etiology, not only do we provide a diagnosis to the patient, a closure to the family, but also many times this particular genetic target also happens to be an important therapeutic target for many important diseases. The focus on diagnosis and treatment is the prevention of disorders. And in terms of genetic diseases, this prevention happens to be to prevent the transmission of the disorder from one generation to the next generation, to actually prevent the occurrence of the disorder in the next generation. So, because the etiology can be diagnosed, depending upon the clinical presentation, and not only the clinical presentation in the program, but the clinical history of the entire family happens to be very important when we choose a test for that particular family or that child. For example, in this particular representative pedigree, where you have this one woman who came to us for prenatal diagnosis, and history found out that her first child is intellectually disabled, and not only her first child, there are many members in the family who have intellectual disability, also have congenital malformation. So in such a pedigree, rather than going for next generation sequencing, which you commonly before, the first step to do would be a karyotype, in which kind a particular marker in the karyotype, which was actually segregating in many of them, which you see in yellow. And these were the ones who were apparently asymptomatic, but they're transmitting this particular marker to the rest of the families. But apart from these cases which present with such diverse presentation, the most common types of genetic disorders that we see are thalassemia, spinal muscular atrophy, in which they have very typical presentation. And for them, we commonly use what we do to prevent the transmission of the disease. We first diagnose the disease in the program. Depending on the presentation, we either go for Sanger sequencing or SMA or a long-range PCR for hemophilia. But what happens when the program is not present? How do we make a diagnosis? For disorders like thalassemia and SMA, where the clinical presentation is very, very specific, what we do is we sequence the parents for that particular gene. We all know that HBB, a single gene is made of 3 exons and can be very easily sequenced. DMD, again, an easily available test is there. So for these disorders, it makes sense to sequence the parents or to test the parents if the program is not alive to provide a prenatal diagnosis. And we have been doing it for the last 3 decades. But in the last many years, what we see is that genetic disorder is lethal because the Mendelian genetic universe is not limited to DMD, SMA, and thalassemia. It comprises of more than 6,000 known genetic disorders and many more which are discovered every year. So for many such genetic disorders, there is no diagnosis. The parents have no investigation left, and what you've seen with our patients is, as soon as the child dies, the parents destroy all the medical documents pertaining to the child. And in such sad state, the couple is left with bits and conjectural pieces of evidence which can in no way help to find out what actually happened to the program. One such case we saw was in 2013. It was a challenging case of a consanguineous family where the couple had 2 infantile deaths, and on history we found out that the first female child developed sepsis and multi-organ failure after an episode of non-healing pre-auricular abscess at 8 months. She also had growth delay and microcephaly. The second child, she developed pneumonia in 2.5 months, persistent cough, fever, and seizures. On investigation, her investigations were present with the parents, and from the investigation found out that she has neutropenia. Neutrophils were absolutely 0. And stool and blood shows presence of microorganisms. So in this case, Because we know congenital neutropenia can be caused due to some genes, we first sequenced those genes in both the parents, but they were found to be negative for this. At that time in 2013, there was no immunodeficiency gene panel available. So we decided to go for the whole exome sequencing of one of the partners, keeping in mind the cost constraint at that time that whole exome sequencing entertained to us. So whole exome sequencing of the mother was done, and she was found to carry a nonsense variant in the NHEJ1 gene. Now this gene leads to severe combined immunodeficiency with microcephaly and growth retardation. So to confirm whether this variant is actually present in the mother, what we do, we go for the gold standard of sequencing, that is the Sanger sequencing. We designed the primers. We found out that the mother is actually heterozygous. So we can see here two peaks that were saved, and these two peaks indicate that the person is heterozygous for that particular variant. So to find out whether the husband is carrying the same variant, we sequenced the husband, Sanger sequencing the husband, and he was found to be heterozygous for the same variant. But this does not confirm the fact that either of the couple's daughter had this disorder. So we needed a sample of the probe in any case to confirm whether this variant was causative of the death of these probands. Fortunately for us, one of the parents happened to carry a piece of the umbilical cord of one of the deceased child. And from this umbilical cord, we extracted the DNA and its Sanger sequencing, and the child was found to be homozygous for this particular mutation. So this shows that how challenging prenatal diagnosis can be in such cases. Another case I have shown you before we go into representative cases is that many times we think that many common manifestations may not be genetic. We tend to think that this may not be genetic, but in this case we were proved wrong. So this was a consanguineous family. The couple came to us with the demise of one of the child, and this child had stillbirth. There was a history of meconium aspiration, there was a history of cauldron in the neck, so it actually looked at birth asphyxia must have been the cause of demise in this particular child. But the parents gave the history that they had a previous stillbirth where the child had apparently polyhydramnios, may or may not be had some foot deformity, so we confirmed that it must be TEV. Syndactyly, because the parents were not sure how the toes looked, but they said that, they were joined. So based upon this presentation and the fact that the couple was consanguineously married, we decided that they should undergo exome sequencing, and we found out that both the parents were carrier for a pathogenic variant in the LMOD3 gene. Now this leads to congenital myopathy, neonatal hypotonia, and respiratory distress. Now all these factors can actually lead to birth asphyxia, which must have led to the meconium aspiration syndrome in the child. So from this we found out that birth asphyxia in this case is an effect of a genetic disorder which caused hypotonia rather than being the cause for hypotonia and neurological symptoms. And we had such many similar cases in the last few years, and that is why we decided to analyze such cases and to find out whether doing next generation sequencing in the parents where there's a history of lethal disorder in the family, whether NGS does actually provide some answers or not. So the advantage of prenatal testing is obvious. This provides a diagnosis in the family where the proband is not alive. This molecular diagnosis helps in predicting the risk of recurrence. It helps in counseling, and on the basis of this molecular diagnosis, we can offer prenatal diagnosis, and it also opens up many reproductive options for the couple. So the aims and objectives of this study were to describe the clinical utility of the NGS-based testing, and we also decided to reanalyze the NGS data in these cases, and we'll see in the upcoming slides on how this was actually useful to us. So we first described the spectrum of the cases which we received in our OPD. We assessed the utility of NGS-based testing in these couples, and also assessed the utility of reanalysis of this data. So, based upon our inclusion criteria, over the last 5 years, we had 52 cases, and in all these cases, clinical exome sequencing was already done earlier. Previous record of these cases included a 3-generation pedigree, antenatal perinatal developmental history, any minor or external anomaly was documented. We started with the entire history of the disease, how it occurred, the course of progression, any hospital admission, any immediate cause of death was scrutinized. In many cases, we found out that the parents did not have any document, any medical record of the child. We also looked at the previous investigation reports if they were present along with the clinical exome sequencing. They were collected and reanalyzed, and the lab was contacted to give us the raw data for reanalysis of this NGS data. So before we go on to representative cases, the demography that we saw in our patients was the spectrum of the disorders based upon the clinical presentation which the patients from that. We made a partial diagnosis for all the cases. With spectrum disorders, and expected. Many of them were having skin disorders, in manner of metabolism, cystic fibrosis, immunodeficiency, neurological disorder, neuromuscular, skeletal, renal. And the miscellaneous group is the one where the program could not be grouped into either of these disorders. So they probably had a mixture of these things, or a category for which this is not right to create another category. So based upon the spectrum of disorders, we found out the diagnostic yield again varied. We had a good diagnostic yield in disorders which are easily diagnosable, that is skin disorders, in one of metabolisms, but we had a low yield comparatively in neuromuscular disorders. Skeletal again, because it's an easily diagnosable entity, we had a very good yield in this. And this actually corroborated with the literature studies that we did. So let's look at the classification of the variants. So in our study, we found out that we had 60% of pathogenic and pathogenic variants in the couple. That is, these were the couples where both the husband and the wife carried a pathogenic or a likely pathogenic variant, which were matching with the disease in the proband. So these were the couples where we could actually provide a diagnosis to the couple. We could actually estimate that this must have been the cause of the death in the proband. But then again, there were 13% cases where we could not find any variant in the parents which could explain the cause of demise in their offsprings. A large category of these variants, for 26%, were variant of uncertain significance. Now, before we go into the further details of what comprises pathogenic variants, so pathogenic variants, there's a chance that the variant we found is actually disease causing. Pathogenic means there's a 90% chance that this variant is definitely disease causing. Similarly, 71% chance that this variant is not disease causing, likely benign, 90% that this variant is definitely not disease causing. And in between these two spectrums lies the variant of uncertain significance. Now, the boundaries of this 90 and 99%, yes, they have been arbitrarily judged by the various guidelines, and they are routinely changed. Various papers look at it whether this particular marker for 90 and 99% is correct or not. So now study found out that out of the 70 variants, these were the yield of the variants, and we found out that 38, that is 54% of variants were novel. So what significance does it hold? This actually tells us that we need to create a population-specific databases. So what we call a novel variant is the one which has not been reported in the literature or in the disease databases that we already have in the web. Now, these disease databases are mostly made up of populations from the Western and European populations. We do not have a population or disease-specific database for our population. That is why many of our variants were novel. And we also points out that for many common disorders as well, for certain disorders that we know that what is the molecular etiology, we need to create population-specific databases so that most of the variants do not turn out to be novel or variant of uncertain significance. We also found out that among those people, those families, we could make a diagnosis. 77% had the same variant, that is, both the variants were the same in both the parents, and only 23% had a different variant. So what does this mean? And among those individuals who had the same variant, majority of them were non-consanguineously married, and only very 43% were consanguineously married. So this points out towards the hidden endogamy that is prevalent in our society. So we normally tend to blame consanguinity for genetic diseases, but through our study we found out that even those couples who married non-consanguineously, they shared the same variant, which shows that they had a common ancestry. So in our society, consanguinity may not be a definite cause for a genetic disease because we are an endogamous population. In our case series, 52 cases, 44 cases underwent, both the parents underwent exome sequencing, but in 8 cases, only the mother underwent exome sequencing, and in 2 families, based upon the result of the exome sequencing we obtained in the mother, the sequencing for the same variant was done in the father. In world over, we saw that so in our study, we had a high paternal take of 88%, that is 88% of males undertook exome sequencing with their wives, but in the world over, what we have seen is the uptake of paternal uptake is not very good. It's only 40 to 73%. Whereas literature says that the reason for such low uptake in the males is one of the main reasons is cost, and then various reasons that the person, the couple feels that there's a low consent for a specific condition. There's a false belief also that males may have no impact on conception and pregnancy. But why they we have such a good uptake. The reason could be of our pre-test counseling. The couple comes to us to ensure that the male also undergoes counseling. And also, there's an increased acceptance when there's a history, traumatic history of loss of previous children. 77% of couples in our cohort have more than 2 affected children with the same disorder. And this actually makes the couple realize that yes, the etiology may be genetic, and if you're planning for the next pregnancy, both the husband and wife need to be actually tested. And diagnostic yield did vary according to the number of the children, but again, this may be false because this depends upon the type of the disorders that came to us. So based upon our cohort, the couple who had the most number of maximum affected children, that is more than 5, we had 5 such couples, and we could have yield in 80% of such couples. But as you can see, that despite having a number of children affected with a particular disorder, there are a certain segment of couples who will not have a genetic diagnosis. And this and next slide would like to discuss the disadvantages of NGS sequencing as well. So, what is the value of making clinical diagnosis? For next generation sequencing is so readily available, and we can just take the blood of the patient and make a diagnosis. What is the value of making clinical diagnosis? We found out that in our cohort, we could make a very specific diagnosis in approximately 22 cases. And in all those 22 cases, again, we could find a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in nearly 73% of the cases. There were 23% of the cases where, despite having a good phenotype, we could not find the pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in the couple. Now, this points us towards the various policies that the NGS technology has. But again, there is an advantage to this. There were many couples where we could not make a certain diagnosis. And even in this vague clinical presentation, we could have a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant which corroborated with the symptoms in the program in approximately 50% of the couples. So this shows the value of doing NGS in such cases where we're still doubtful whether a genetic condition may or may not be actually causative. So, my representative cases that I want to discuss would be of various types, where they have definite phenotype, there will be genetic heterogeneity, case of VUS, carry for more than one disorder, single parent carrier, copy number variant, and a few cases where no variant was found. So the first case that we had was a child who died 1.5 years, and all the parents could tell us that the child, in the X-rays, the doctors used to say that the bones are very dense. And based upon this is a specific phenotype for a disorder known as osteopetrosis. So obviously, the couple went underwent exome sequencing, and we found a pathogenic and a likely pathogenic variant in both the mother and the father, and we could confirm in this case that the diagnosis must have been osteopetrosis. In the second case, they had a history of demise at 3 months and 5 months, and all the parents could tell us that the ultrasound showed that the kidneys in the children were enlarged and had multiple cysts. So this is a very common disorder of polycystic kidneys, and based upon this diagnosis, exome sequencing was done, and they were found to have a pathogenic variant in PKHD1 gene, which leads to polycystic kidney disease with or without polycystic liver disease. So definite phenotype was confirmed in carrier screening in these 2 cases. Then again, there were some cases where the phenotype was definite, but where clinical investigations actually helped us in confirming the phenotype. So we had 2 cases where one family presented with recurrent non-immune hydros fetalis, and the other cases the child had a vague clinical presentation of lethargy, seizures, and coma. But luckily for us, in this case, both the couples had preserved one piece of document related to the child. That is, in the child who had recurrent NIHF, enzyme assay was done from the cord blood of the fetus, and this was positive for MPS 7. And for the case with lethargy, seizures, and coma, the diagnosis can be variable, but in this case, TMS had already been done in the child, and that was suggestive of maple syrup urine disease. Based upon this, exome sequencing in the parents was done, and we found out that this particular variant of uncertain significance that we had obtained, we could classify that to pathogenic. So this shows that the high suspicion for genetic disorders is a must, because specific clinical investigation done at the correct time in this particular family helped us in calling the variant to be pathogenic. Next, we have another case that there was a history of IUFD at 8 months, and the parents said that the doctor said that the child apparently had short, long bones. And in the next pregnancy, in ultrasound, the doctor told them that this child also had short, long bones, and this pregnancy was terminated. Now, this couple comes to us that there is a history of demise of children with short, long bones. Now, short, long bones can have a number of differential diagnoses. It's not easy to pinpoint one particular genetic diagnosis for that. So, in this case, is that genetic heterogeneity exists. Carrier screening again was useful because we found out that the parents were carriers for a pathogenic variant in the EVC2 gene. This leads to Ellis-Von-Crevin syndrome. Now, for this family, this is particularly important because not only can we offer prenatal diagnosis, Conditions can be easily diagnosed in ultrasound. Pre-conditions are provided. This diagnosis before even implanted in the uterus. Before we can also do a genetic diagnosis for this family. In some case, we have history of history of 300 events, and all we do is the SMPD1 gene. This leads to Niemann-Pick disease type A. We had a similar family again who had history of hepatocellular liver failure, but in that case, a diagnosis of tyrosinemia 1 was made because the parents were carrying for a pathogenic variant in that particular gene. So this shows that tyrosine has utility in genetic disorders which have genetic heterogeneity as well. Then again, there are many disorders which have a vague clinical presentation. In this particular family, there is a history of stillbirth, a child died of seizures, then another a childhood death due to infantile delay. And this, for this child, the MRI was suggested, the documents show that the MRI suggested hypomyelination. So based upon this vague clinical presentation, exome sequencing was offered to the parents, and we found out that both the parents were carrying for a significant variant in the GALC gene, which leads to Krabbe disease. So even in non-specific clinical presentation, exome sequencing has its value, as we have seen in the previous pie chart, that in 50% of such cases, we were able to make a good diagnosis. Now let's look into the cases with variants of uncertain significance. So, variant of uncertain significance is a daunting challenge. Even when the proband is alive, it's a daunting challenge, but at least when you have the person right in front of you in which you've got the VUS, we can go for functional analysis of the various tissues of the patient to finally confirm the variant to be either pathogenic or benign. But what happens in cases when the proband is not alive and both the parents are found to be carriers of a variant of uncertain significance? Now, this is a daunting challenge in various carrier screening studies that we have seen that it is difficult for the investigators to classify these variants. In one particular study, there is familial segregation study. So in familial segregation studies, what we do is that what the variants found in the parents, we sequence those variants in the alive members of the families. If any of the VUS is found to be homozygous condition, that is both the variants are found to be any of the healthy asymptomatic individuals, we classify them as benign. But again, this again has its own utilities. Many times family members may not be present, they may not be willing to give samples, or the VUS again may be heterozygous in them. So such studies have helped in one particular author to classify 3% of these variants of uncertain significance as benign. So this shows that VUS is still again a big challenge, especially when we go for parental testing by proxy. In this particular case, we had a demise of a child at the age of 2 years and she had weakness. Her documents show that she had raised CPK. EMG was test of myopathy, but muscle biopsy clearly says that the child has muscular dystrophy. A clear phenotype, a very specific diagnosis. We did find exome sequencing a variant of uncertain significance in both the parents. That is in MYO18B, it leads to Klippel-Feil syndrome 4, autosomal recessive with myopathy and facial dysmorphism. So this looks likely to be the cause of the disease in the proband. In another case, we found that there was history of jaundice with failure to thrive, and both the babies had a neonatal death. And in this case, we found a variant of uncertain significance in the PEX13 gene, which does explain the phenotype of the children. But do we consider them to be causative of the disease in the proband? In heart of heart, we may feel that yes, this is the cause. But then we have to be very wary of something known as the variant of uncertain significance. This is specific phenotype with the VUS in parents, but unfortunately, we cannot do functional analysis, and without functional analysis, we cannot actually call these variants to be benign or pathogenic. There are various studies they have tried to reclassify the VUS, and they have found out that in reclassification, majority of the VUS, they will turn out to be benign or likely benign, and very few of them will actually turn out to be pathogenic. So in this case, whether to offer prenatal diagnosis in the next pregnancy or not is a big question, because if you offer a prenatal diagnosis based upon the VUS present, and the child happens to be healthy, then we'll be terminating a healthy pregnancy. So again, this is a big question to offer, but we feel that prenatal diagnosis for such cases should not be offered without functional analysis. Then in many cases we found out that one of the parents was a carrier and the other was not. In this particular case, the child had a death at 7 days, and the parents say that the child had bullous lesion all over the body and the child died because of septicemia. On exome sequencing, we found out that the father is a carrier of a variant of uncertain significance in the COL7A1 gene, but the mother was not found to have any variant in this particular gene. Not in this variant, she was not found to have a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in any of the genes which are associated with similar presentation. In other case, a consanguineously married couple, 2 deaths because of hydrops fetalis, and we found out many variants. The mother was a carrier for one variant in the NEU1 gene, and the father was a heterozygous for variants in the PIZ1 gene and the CHRND gene. Now, all these 3 disorders can explain the hydrops fetalis. But since they're not present in the same gene, we cannot actually call them to be pathogenic for the likely condition. But again, there are many causes of why the particular gene the variant was not picked up in other parent, because maybe it's an autosomal dominant disorder we're looking at, it's a de novo variant in the proband, or maybe it's an autosomal dominant condition which is occurring again because of gonadomosaicism. The variant is probably located in a non-coding region or a deep intronic region which is not routinely picked up by next generation sequencing. It's a structural variant not picked up by NGS. Disease is not identified yet. It's a new gene, and because our disease databases are not updated, and that is why we could not find the variant. Or maybe the gene is actually present in the mother or in either of the parents, but it was not picked up because of poor coverage. There can be many causes for why this family did not have a diagnosis. Then there was a main reason of viewers in our study was sole exome sequencing, in where the male partner did not undergo testing. So in 4 such cases, we had the maternal variant that we found was actually matching with the clinical features in the proband, but this was already many of them were known and many of them were reported novel, and they were classified as VUS. So in this case, sequencing and if the father is carrying a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant, in that case, based upon ACMG guidelines, we can classify some of these variants to be considered of the proband. But even if the father claims to be variant diagnosis will be VUS. So it's wise to make sure that all the factors are sequencing these. Will delay hypertonia and frequent infection, and NGS did not actually pick up any disorders. So in this case, microarray told us that there is a duplication of the XQ28 region in the mother. Now again, a copy number variant which does explain the phenotype in the children. And this actually leads to a known immune disorder that is severe neurodevelopmental defect. So based upon this, we can do offer clinical diagnosis, but then you must remember that this was actually picked up by a copy number variant tool on the exome sequencing, but not a microarray. So this points us towards that there are many causative factors of the disease which cannot be picked up by next generation sequencing. In this case, we could not find any variant. Consanguineous family, polyhydramnios in both the fetuses, both the babies. One had decreased fetal movement, the other had macromelia or lumbosacral deformity. But again, we could not find any variant. Again, the reasons why no variant could be found out could be because of de novo variant, gonadomosaicism, variant non-locating, non-locating region, maybe the structural variant, disease not identified, poor coverage, or in many cases, maybe there's a common genetic factor which does explain, because polyhydramnios, lumbosacral deformity, they're very environmental agents can explain this thing. But in 2 pregnancies back to back, it's difficult to say, but then again, it cannot be entirely ruled out. So, counseling for such cases that this appears to be autosomal recessive and the risk of recurrence may range from 0 to 25%. This is how we will counsel such families. Now let's come to the DNA acid exome data. We had the NGS data of majority of our patients, and we did find out that we could upgrade or degrade the classification and found a dual diagnosis in many such cases. In this particular case, the child died at 20 days due to recurrent pneumonitis. There was peritonitis, meconomelia, suspected to have cystic fibrosis. And initially, the report that we got from the lab was that the parents were carrying for a pathogenic variant in the AMPD1 gene. Now, this gene leads to myopathy due to myoadenylate deaminase deficiency and does explain the phenotype in the proband. But then after 4 or 5 years, when we reclassified the variant, we first looked at the population database. We found out that there are 4 homozygotes for this particular variant. Now remember, NOMAD is a population database based upon healthy individuals. So if there are 4 homozygotes for that particular variant, it's very unlikely that this can be a pathogenic variant, because healthy individuals carrying this variant in homozygous form, that means that this is definitely not disease causing. We again looked at the ClinVar. ClinVar is a disease database and found out that this particular variant has been reported as benign by the clinical in the year 2021. Now, this exome sequencing was done in the year 2016 or 17. So this shows us the value of review the population and the disease database for every NGS report that we have, because this classification may change over the time with the availability of new evidence in the literature and the population databases. In this particular case, again, there were 2 deaths because of meconium aspiration, poor cry, they had failure to thrive, dystonia, and initially the lab gave a report of various uncertain significance in the KLHL7 gene. This leads to Perchin syndrome, which in autosomal recessive manner does lead to these features. But we, based upon the evidence that we studied, we found this, we could classify this variant as pathogenic, and how? We found out that there are papers which show that this loss of function in this particular gene does actually lead to disease. Now remember, it was very easy to classify frame shift variants as pathogenic because it looks that, a protein is terminating there, that this must be disease causing. But we have to remember when we classify the variants as per the ACMG guidelines, it clearly says that loss of function or frame shift truncating variants should not be classified as pathogenic or likely pathogenic unless there is an evidence that this particular variant does lead to loss of function of the disease. There are many diseases where loss of function is not known to be a mechanism of the disease. So in this particular case, we reviewed the literature and found out that there are papers which say that yes, loss of function can be a cause of disease, and based upon this, we could classify this variant as pathogenic. So this shows that not only population and disease database, it's also important to look at the literature associated with that particular variant, and this becomes most important when we're looking for very, very rare disorders. So based upon that, we, as a such, should all exomes be reanalyzed? There were many systematic reviews, and one of them said that yes, NGS data reanalysis has value because it gives an overall, increases the overall yield by 10%. And how long after should this data be realized? So they say there is no particular guidelines, but in their study, in their meta-analysis, they say that preferably more than 24 months after the original analysis. In our experience, we feel that before we offer prenatal diagnosis, because we are actually deciding the fate of a fetus, it's important to reanalyze these variants before every pregnancy. Then there's a case where we had 4 such cases where the clinical features were significant. We found a final diagnosis in both the parents. The genes were matching with the phenotype, but on looking at the parents' data, we found out that the parents were carriers for pathogenic or likely pathogenic variants in another gene, for which the phenotype is not seen in their proband. But then again, since they are carriers, that it does mean, and these all are autosomal recessive disorder, this does mean that this could have also, many of the children can also have this particular disorder. But since the clinical features which they have come with does not present with either seizures, cortical blindness, we cannot actually call this variant to be called to win them. Another case, we have mother carrying a G6PD variant. Now in this case, we can actually tell the mother that she is a carrier of G6PD. We will not have a prenatal diagnosis for this, but at least we can counsel her to avoid certain things which will lead to hemolysis. Then we had 2 more cases. We had death due to seizures and GDD, and a variant caused of the disease was found in the parents. On reanalysis, we found out another variant which could also explain this particular clinical manifestation. Not only this, in another case as well, there were 4 deaths due to respiratory distress, GDD, diarrhea, and a pathogenic variant was found in the EPCAM gene, which does explain. But then, maybe can also have a similar presentation. In these 6 cases, the parents are found to be carriers of another gene for which the proband, the features on these 2 cases, the proband does have some matching features. So we call these as shared carrier status. The exact, we tell them that the exact diagnosis of the cause of the illness in the child can never be confirmed. It can only be presumed because these are all again also recessive conditions. And if the parents are carrier, yes, there is a risk that the child in the next pregnancy may inherit this. This result that we have obtained, apart from the phenotype that is present in the child, they will be counted as part of expanded carrier screening, for which the couple can be additionally offered prenatal or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. We also explained then that the risk of recurrence of both the condition in the child is 1/16. And of either of the condition, as we can see from this Punnett scale, is approximately 6/16. So there is a good 40-50% chance that for these shared carrier status, the children may have either of the diseases or both the diseases in approximately 40 to 50% of the cases. So from all this analysis, we convey to our patients that the diagnosis established nothing but a surrogate verdict because we could not confirm these diagnoses in the program. So in such scenarios is counseling, pre-test and post-test both. We have to explain the yield of the sequencing in such cases. We explain the difficulties associated with the interpretation of variants, especially in cases of uncertain significance. We talk to them about the cost involved, sequence other parameters to roll out the VUS. We have to talk about the turnaround time because many of them will be planning pregnancies and reproductive options which are available to them even if they do not choose to not to undergo such kind of testing, that is donor gamete or adoption, which actually reduces their risk. We did a review of literature studies, that similar studies that have been conducted in the world, and we found out that in most of these literature studies, the yield ranges from 30 to 64%, but this again can vary based upon the spectrum of the disorders that have been included in the study. In our continuous study has been conducted, and from our study we found out that we could provide a diagnosis in approximately 60% of our families. But there were major limitations. We could not look for copy number variant in all our cases. There was no provision of to study the lack of segregation of the family members to identify whether this view is actually pathogenic or benign. And again, small sample size. If we had many number of patients, this again can be extrapolated. So to conclude, diagnostic yield of exome sequencing in the parent, that is parental testing by proxy, is 60%. And yes, this can be offered as a first-line test in many selected cases. For cases where there is a vague clinical presentation, the diagnostic yield is 50%. That shows the power of the NGS. We have a highly prevalent endogamous society, so consanguinity cannot be blamed for the genetic disorders. Reanalysis is important. We increase the yield by approximately 15% in our cohort, and again, pre-test and post-test counseling is equally important. But then after this thing, we asked ourselves this question, that can such kind of testing be applied to asymptomatic couples who do not have a history of a lethal disorder in the family? The main aim is to prevent the birth of a child with genetic disorder by screening both the parents whether they're carriers for a pathogenic variant for any lethal disorder. Now, this concept of carrier screening is not new. This all started in Greece where one physician decided to screen the population, and we found out that 23% of population was carrier for HPS. Later on, such carrier screening programs were carried in the same region to screen for beta thalassemia, and they were extended to Caucasians for screening of cystic fibrosis, in the Ashkenazis is used for Tay-Sachs disease. And obviously these programs were successful because they reduced the incidence of thalassemia by a great majority over the last few years. But then ACOG in 2009 said that it's becoming increasingly difficult to assign a particular ethnicity to one individual. So they decided, and with the advent of the increasing sequencing technology that we have at our hand, they give the term expanded carrier screening, which means nothing but a panel-based screening, that is, to select a number of genes of multiple disorders, irrespective of racial and ethnic origin, to be offered to couples who wish to know the carrier status for the same. Many such studies have also been done. In this particular study, they studied 6 ancestries, and they found out that one of the couples, approximately 0.17 to 2.52%, depending on their ethnicity, they are carrier for a pathogenic variant in a severe recessive condition. And based upon this result, they can be counseled when they want to go to or a PIGD diagnosis. But then again, is this possible in our population? In a population obsessed with healthy children that we have, that carrier screening in our population has a number of challenges. First, it's difficult to counsel for disorders. Thalassemia, SMA, DMD, these are relatively common genetic disorders which people have seen. It's difficult to explain to them that what are the significance of screening for such disorders. But for many Mendelian disorders, for which the phenotype is again very rare, it's very difficult to explain to them the implications of screening. We now have a disease database, so many variants that we'll have will be actually variant of uncertain significance. Now, with these high number of variants of uncertain significance, should the couple undergo prenatal diagnosis or not? There's a lack of population database as well. How to select the number of the genes that we decide for carrier screening? Again, if a parent is if one of the individuals is actually found to carry a pathogenic or maybe a VUS variant, the anxiety and the guilt associated with it, I should not transfer this way into the next generation. And also, very important part is that negative report does not eliminate risk because NGS cannot detect all the variants. There are many limitations to it. So we have to explain to them that despite having a negative result does not mean that you do not have a high risk of having such child. So based upon this, I would like to end today's CGR with the fact that molecular diagnosis of the pronoun is very, very important. Etiology may be genetic for many common manifestations, that is why it's important to have a genetic eye for such disorders. And although NGS can tell you diagnosis in many cases, the need for an astute clinician is now more than ever because detailed clinical and investigative examination of the pronoun is very important. Because if molecular, and in many cases, if somebody is not able to make a molecular diagnosis, not feasible, we request them to save the sample of the protein in EDTA van. That will help us in confirming the diagnosis. And if nothing else works, then yes, parental exome sequencing can be done in many such cases. Thank you.